Thank you. Thank all of you for coming. And it's a pleasure to be here. I was born in New York City, haven't lived here for 20 years, so I think this is my my first stop on my book tour back in my hometown, and so it's fitting. So yes, I wrote Alienated America because I had a story to tell. It's a story about the American dream and the perception that it's dead. So it's a story about work. It's a story about family. It's a story about community. It's a story about faith. And it's also, to some extent, a story about how Donald Trump became president of the United States. And because I'm a political reporter, my story begins in Iowa. And because I'm an Irish Catholic, my story begins in a bar. It was Joe's place in Iowa City a few weeks before the 2016 caucuses. And I met this couple that worked at the university. And she said she was from Orange City, Iowa. And again, 2016, I'd covered a handful of caucuses. And I'd heard of Orange City, but I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anybody from there. And as I said, I'm an Irish Catholic. So if you know Irish history, the color orange can be a little triggering to some of us. So I said, what exactly is Orange City? I was afraid it was a bunch of Ulstermen marching through the street. And it's related, but she said, no, we're Dutch. And so again, I'm interested in ethnicity, growing up here in New York as an Irish Catholic and out in Pelham where everybody was either Irish or Italian. And so I said, just how Dutch are you? And so this woman, whose name was Holly Vander or something, she told me, we used to wear wooden clogs marching past Windmill Square for Tulip Festival. And now again, not back home in the Netherlands, up in Orange City, Iowa, in Sioux County. This was like a Simpsons episode send-up of Dutch people in middle America. And so I had to go. So I go out there to a Jeb Bush rally before the caucuses. And sure enough, everybody's Dutch. They're all Hollies and have Vander Voss and those sort of names. But also, I found something very, very interesting. In these early before the caucuses, in Sioux County, Iowa, Orange City, there was almost no interest in Donald Trump. Now, again, in the general election, they would vote for him. Very Republican county. He won the county easily. But when it came to choosing among these 16 people, there's very little interest in them. So I was wondering, what one pastor told me of his 900 people sitting in his pews every Sunday. He knew of one who was going to vote for Trump as opposed to Cruz or Rubio or Jeb or Kasich or that sort of stuff. And sure enough, Trump bombed in Orange City and Sioux County. Sioux County was his worst county in the whole state. 11% he got there, while the rest of the state he got about 25%, and in rural Iowa as a whole he got about 30%. Of his 5 worst counties in the Iowa caucuses, 2 were these high-income, highly educated counties near Des Moines. The other 3 were Orange County, Marion County, and Lyon County, which are the 3 Dutchest counties in all of Iowa. So something was going on here. I'm used to writing about, the Hispanic vote or the Cuban vote or the black vote, but there was like a Dutch vote. So I had to go figure out what this was. So I look at Western Michigan when they're about to vote in their primaries, and sure enough, Trump dominates in Michigan, wins almost every county except for the 5 counties around Holland, Michigan. And it's in order. The Dutcher it is, the more Cruz, the better Cruz does. And so there's all sorts of people offering explanations. And I asked Ted Cruz, I said, why do you think you're winning so well in these Dutch counties, in Iowa and Michigan? And he said, well, Tim, these Dutch people, they're good country people, they're nice people, and Donald's not nice. They want to vote for somebody who's nice. And I'm thinking, like Ted Cruz? And somebody else offered to me that the Dutch were upset that Trump was appropriating the color orange, but I don't think that was true. What was going on? When I had spoken to the people at Dordt College, the college back in Sioux County, Iowa, one liberal guy who just moved there, his wife was a professor, he said, out here they vote right but live left. Now, then, when he said that, I thought I was like onto a big story. What was going on? Was this some like secret rural county of pot-smoking swingers going on here? He said, no, people take care of their neighbors. They take care of anybody in need. They care for creation. And I was thinking, I was really annoyed that he called that living left, but I knew what he meant by that. He saw a very high level of social trust and sense of duty to people in need. And guess what? That's what you see if you, as well in Western Michigan, if you ever visit Holland or Grand Rapids. There was a profile in 2017 in the New Yorker of Orange City, Iowa. It's saying there are plenty of jobs. It'll take you 5 minutes to drive to work. When you have children, we'll help you take care of them. People share your values. It's a good Christian place, and they care about you. If anything happens, they'll have your back. And so it started to become clear to me what was happening. The man who declared that the American dream was dead was doing very poorly in the places where the American dream was most alive. So leading up to the Wisconsin primary, I visited Oostburg, Wisconsin. This is one of the most Dutch municipalities in all of America, 50% Dutch. I plopped myself at Judy's Diner, and because I did it on a Sunday morning, what should have been obvious to me earlier in these other places became obvious. As the families came pouring in from the 9 o'clock service at First Reformed Church and Bethel Orthodox Presbyterian, and then from the 9:15 at First Presbyterian Church, and then the 9:30 services at the First Christian Reformed Church. In this village of 2,000 people in rural Wisconsin, there were 4 churches, all in the Reformed Christian vein. 4 Protestant churches, very similar, and all of the same tradition that you find in Orange City and in Holland, Michigan. So the thing that made these Dutch communities so strong were the churches, the Christian schools, the other church-related institutions. These Reformed churches had planted themselves across Middle America, but not just planted churches, planted and built communities, tightly knit communities that avoided all the other afflictions that are and have been hitting rural America. The inequality, the retreat from marriage, out of wedlock births, opioids, those were a lot less present in these places. And it wasn't just the Dutch, of course. Trump's second worst state in the whole U.S. In the primaries, if you remember, was Utah, where the Mormons are famous at building community around their church. And I saw it closer to home. So I live in Silver Spring, Maryland. Trump easily won Silver Spring in the Republican primaries. But if you look at a precinct map, there were 2 little precincts kind of near my house that he absolutely bombed in, that Ted Cruz won. What defines those 2 precincts? Each one of them has an Orthodox synagogue in it. And of course, there's a prohibition for them to drive on the Sabbath. So everybody has to live within walking distance of the synagogue. So it builds these immense, tightly knit communities. So in these strong religious communities, that in the end, not so much the Orthodox Jews, but the Mormons and the Christian Reform, they would vote Republican, obviously. But when they were asked of these 17 people who to vote for, they weren't voting for the guy that said the American dream was dead. So this is the environment in which the American dream seems most alive, were these strong religious communities. Now, quick note about living in Silver Spring next to these Orthodox synagogues. My wife and I have 6 children, and so when she walks into a grocery store with 6 children, people make certain assumptions. You walk into the supermarket there, and they send you to the kosher food aisles, which is better than in most grocery stores where you walk in with 6 kids and they send you to the family planning aisle. But it wasn't just the religious communities that rejected Trump early on. The same day Cruz carried those Orthodox precincts near my house, I was actually down the road a bit in the village of Chevy Chase. Some of you might have heard of Chevy Chase, Maryland. This is where Brett Kavanaugh is from. But he's from sort of lesser Chevy Chase, the town of Chevy Chase, which is only very rich. The village of Chevy Chase is the wealthiest municipality in the whole D.C. area, which is the wealthiest area in the country. The median home in Chevy Chase costs $1.5 million compared to $150,000 in Oostburg. The good point of comparison, because they're both villages of about 2,000. Also good point of comparison because Trump bombed and got the same percentage in both of them, about 15%. Donald Trump got 54% statewide in Maryland in the Republican primary. He got 15% in Chevy Chase. And you see it everywhere. The elites were rejecting Donald Trump. Michigan, I talked about. Holland, look at Grosse Pointe or Ann Arbor, and they reject him. Wisconsin, Waukesha, Ozaukee, Washington, the wealthiest, most educated counties. That's where Trump did the worst besides just Oostburg. So what was going on again was the elites, again, rejecting Trump. So it seems like there's 2 different things going on here, right? Highly educated, wealthy, left-leaning places had no interest in Donald Trump in the primaries, and conservative religious places had no interest in Donald Trump in the primaries. But what I argue in Alienated America is that that's one phenomenon. The guy who said the American dream is dead did poorly where the American dream is most alive, and the American dream is most alive in the places with strong institutions of civil society. The organizations, the entities, the clubs, the churches, the things that bring us together give us a sense of purpose. Again, whether it's your church, whether it's a church-related charity, whether it's Chevy Chase Country Club, whether it's a professional network or a Little League, all of those institutions are strongest in two types of places, which are the strong religious places and elite places where people have college degrees. Where these institutions are, the American dream is alive, but in much of the country, these institutions have corroded. And that is the root of working class struggle. The affliction of working class and middle America is this. Too many places have too few robust institutions of civil society, too few things for people to belong to. They're left alienated, lacking a safety net and a sense of purpose, connection, and the infrastructure that leads to the good life. So sometimes it's easy to miss what community does. If you're here, you might belong to this institution. You might, the odds are at almost any audience I speak to, it's people who are plugged into multiple institutions. If you went to college, you're connected to alumni networks. If you have a job, a white-collar job, you probably see your colleagues as friends and the sort of people from whom you can get and provide modeling and a sense of purpose and those sort of ideas. It can be very easy to take for granted. So what do? The first thing is they provide a safety net. And so just the one brief reading I'll do, it's from the preface to my book, an incident that happened while I was working on it. So my daughter Eve had a breathing issue, and she was sick, and we were keeping her home, and we did for Sunday morning mass what we call the divide and conquer, where I went with the boys to the 8:30 mass, and my wife stayed home with the baby and the other kids, and then my wife went with our oldest daughter to the 11:30 mass. So I'm holding Eve, and I see she's going from sort of lethargic to downright slumped, and I check her blood oxygen level with this little pulse oximeter I had bought from CVS. Very glad I bought it, and the level was just way too low. And so I try calling Katie, but of course your phone's not on during mass, right? So the phone is just like ringing silently in her purse, and so I just Katie has a car, so I throw Eve in the jogging stroller and start sprinting down the street to the urgent care center. And at one point, Katie sees this, comes out with it. Eve ends up in Children's Hospital and is there for a week. We got so many offers of help or food during this time that I felt guilty about my inability to field them all. My cup runneth over was the Bible verse that crossed my mind. And so as I woke up one morning at 4 a.m. with a sore neck in the tiny curtained booth of the intensive care unit, I had an image of this swarm of friends, family, and neighbors rallying to our aid. But as I considered it more during our stay, I saw in greater detail the contours of the support we were enjoying. As I thought about each person or couple who helped us or wrote or called, I noticed these weren't simple bilateral relationships. In almost every case, there was an institution that linked us. Again, this wasn't how we thought about our friends. They were just our friends. But whenever I described to the others, like the nurses, the help we got, I found myself speaking of the couple from our parish or the family from our pool. Some help came from friends at our boys' school. Others were my college classmates. Others were work colleagues at the Examiner or at the American Enterprise Institute. Parents of the kids I had coached in T-ball helped. The woman who sent a corner bakery feast is in my wife's book club and attends the same Virginia parish as my wife's parents. We got a Grubhub gift card that came from an organization on whose board I had sat. Our dense and broad network of friends, which became a short-term safety net, wasn't merely a network of friends. It was a network of organizations, companies, churches, schools, and clubs. The hubs that bound us to these friends are what we call institutions of civil society. So that's one thing it does. But there's more it does. It's sort of the opposite, right? Is a sense of purpose. I think if you go out and you go to a lot of the places I went in reporting on this where things seem to be collapsed and you talk to people in depressed communities, one thing you find is a lack of purpose. And Charles Murray got in trouble when he wrote about the virtues that are missing in a lot of the working class, because he said idleness is this vice, and people said, oh, he's attacking them as vicious people. But I think of idleness as an affliction, and this is why. If you belong to something, you find that you get tied up in all sorts of responsibilities, and people need you, and they ask you to do stuff, not because you signed up for it, but because you know that person who comes walking down the hall. You see her coming out of church or at the swim club. You say, oh gosh, Karen's going to ask me to do something again. And so we are saved from idleness, not out of our own virtue. It's a virtue because we practice it. Happened to me while I was working on this. Somebody comes up to me after Mass and says, oh, Tim, I see Meg is signed up for basketball. We're looking for a coach for that team. Meg was in kindergarten at the time. Kindergarten basketball should not exist. The only reason that she got signed up is because my wife thought she would look cute in basketball shorts running around. I was saying, well, you don't need a coach. They know how to look cute. They don't need a coach to look cute. And I said, look, any other year I would do it. I'm really busy this year. What are you doing? Well, I'm working on a book. What's the book about? Well, it's about strong institutions of community. Yeah. So I coach kindergarten girls basketball. So if you haven't felt purposeless, think about it. A large part of it is because you belong to these things. So there's lots of economic data in the book. I'll skip over some of that. I want to talk about where it's dead, and in the questions maybe we can get to the causes and the solutions. But so one of the things I do, I have a colleague, Byron York, used to be Catherine's colleague at National Review. We poached him at the Examiner about 10 years ago. And he has described a big part of the kind of thing I do as bar reporting, which is to say, I go and I sit down at a bar and I talk to people, and so they start talking about politics and I write about it. So you can't just do bar reporting at any bar. If you go to a college bar, for instance, they don't vote. Half of them are from out of state. Go to a hotel bar, disaster. Most of them are from out of state, etc. So what I found was a sweet spot was what I called yuppie Irish pubs, because there was wealthy, there was middle class, there was a little bit of working class, there was men and women and left and right. You'd always find the man's voting for Romney, his wife is voting for Obama. Just makes for great content, right? The places I started skipping after 2004 were what I called roadside country bars, where there's not like a parking lot. It's just there's the road and then there's gravel. And you can't see inside the bar from the street. So it's really intimidating. And then you open it up and everybody stares at you, and hopefully you're not dressed like this. And you sit down and you try to talk about politics and they'd all say, I don't care about politics. It's a bunch of BS. Well, in 2016 or late 2015, you walked into those very same bars and people said, politics is a bunch of BS and that's why I'm voting for Donald Trump. So at one such bar, Smittys, again, the kind of bar I'd skipped in the 08 and 2012 cycles, I show up there. This is in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, Fayette County, so south of Pittsburgh, former coal, former steel country. I walk in, and politics is what you think. Everybody's white. Everybody's voting for Trump. You ask them about issues, because in Washington, we always think people vote on issues, which of course they don't. But you ask about issues, and they'll say guns. You ask them about the economy, and they say this contradictory thing. Oh, A, there's no jobs, but B, nobody wants to work. And then they get going on this, and they talk about, oh, this guy who's on disability and he's not disabled, this guy who's on unemployment and he's just milking it. So the guy takes his food stamps and he sells it so that he can buy drugs, which he then sells. And all these stories go on. And I think in Smittys there's a racial undercurrent to it. Maybe, maybe not. But, story, oh, this woman bought steak with her food stamps to feed to her dog. And it's going on, and these stories about the non-working, lazy neighbors in Uniontown are all being told by men sitting at the bar at 2:30 on a Tuesday. And yes, I was sitting at a bar on 2:30 on a Tuesday, but again, this was literally my job, so you can't question me for that. So 2:30 on a Tuesday, and so I turned to one guy. I say, Dave, why don't you work? He's about 50. He says, oh, well, my back, and excruciating story of back surgeries. And I say, so there's the work around here is all manual, I guess. There's no office jobs. He said, no, Tim, I can't sit at a desk for 30 minutes. It kills. And I said, Dave, you've been sitting at this bar stool for about an hour and a half. And he looks at me. He says, well, today I'm numb because my son died this morning. So the story, the numbers I had seen about places like this, and I knew mattered, but I'd sort of abstracted away. That story was now looking me in the face. And the possibilities I'd entertained, that the people who said the American dream was dead were just bitter that they had lost some sort of privilege, or they just, they were fantasizing about some non-existing past, or that they were really just doing fine and it was some political anger. All of those possible explanations that I had read and entertained disappeared. The suffering and the devastation in so much of these formerly industrial places across the middle of the country was real. And it was not a purely economic story. When you looked around these places, well, I mean, just the consequences, suicide rates by state, inversely proportional to population density, which is an interesting fact. One psychiatrist said, we're not living in community anymore. We're living in isolation. We don't have people to provide meaning and give hope. That was his explanation for the rise in suicides. Opioid deaths are much higher in southwestern Pennsylvania in these sort of places than they are otherwise. Lots of other negative consequences are occurring in these places. The retreat from marriage is happening mostly among the working class. There's a reduction in marriage among college-educated people, but that's mostly a postponement. It's part of what I call the Lena Dunham fallacy, that so many conservative Christians think that the left liberals are all, swingers who are eschewing marriage, and these girls are graduating from Wesleyan with their Catherine McKinnon in hand, and that's not what's causing the retreat from marriage mostly. It's mostly that working class women either are getting divorced or not getting married. And there's lots of explanations, but one of them is that there's not a lot of men worth marrying in a lot of these places. I have a different explanation. It's that marriage and family formation are not something that a couple can do. If you guys ever read the Odyssey, there's a character called the Cyclops who lives in his cave with his wives and his children. And from a very abstract perspective, you could call him a family guy because he spends all his time providing for his wives and his children, right? But no, he's a monster. He's the most hideous monster in this whole book because he doesn't interact with other people. So I borrowed a phrase from a wise woman, and for a chapter in my book, it takes a village to raise a child. The reason that marriage is on the retreat in so much of working class America is because you need these institutions of civil society. You need to have neighbors you can rely on. You need to belong to something like a parish or a swim club, or have a public school that's not just a factory, but something that all sorts of people belong to. And so all these negative outcomes come from the collapse of community. And so finally, let me just say, when I talk about community, there's a reason there's a church on the front of Alienated America, and not just a factory. When the factory closes down, I think that's often the first domino. But it's when the church closes down that the dagger is driven through the heart of these communities. Why? Because church is a fundamental central institution of civil society in America, particularly for the working class and the middle class. The elites of Chevy Chase, first of all, they go to church more. If you go to Blessed Sacrament, which is Brett Kavanaugh's parish, the pews are a lot more filled there than they are down in southern Maryland, a rural area where a good friend of mine is a priest. But also, if they don't go to church, they have other things to go to. And we could say yoga or country clubs, but that's sort of a little bit dismissive. It's also, volunteer organizations. They run and serve on local government. A lot of the people in this room know that there's so many other things to belong to. For the middle class and the working class, the main institution that people have belonged to has been the church. Church-going children have much better results. My colleague Brad Wilcox has written tons of that, and it's all in the book. And there's a million reasons for this, but and I think the Christian teaching is a main part of it. But on a sociological level, the most important thing is attendance. The good outcomes that come from religiosity do not come from just self-professed religiosity. And the political stuff I was talking about early on, who came out of the woodwork to vote for Trump, who never was involved in politics, they were white evangelicals who do not go to church. And I knew some people who were very anti-Trump, whether they're liberals or conservatives, who said, yeah, they're a bunch of hypocrites. No, that's not the story. The story is there were people who didn't have something to belong to, and they believed that the American dream was dead. And so, again, I don't want to distract you on the politics. All sorts of religious people now are much more likely to support Trump, largely because of what the alternative is. But the fact is that attending a church is the best and easiest and cheapest way to belong to something, and not just anything, but something that gives you a joint, higher sense of purpose, something to aim for and aspire to outside of yourself. So and again, we should talk about the causes and the solutions later on, but if you want to look at what's going on in America, it's this. America's been a secularizing country for all sorts of reasons. The secularization has been manageable for highly educated, wealthy people. For the working class and middle class, the secularization has been devastating and even deadly. And so if you want to talk about what the turnaround is going to be, it's going to be something like a great awakening. It's going to be finding more of America to look like Salt Lake City and to look like Orange City, Iowa. Anyway, I'm very happy you guys came to listen and happy to keep talking about this. Thank you.
So I knew New York City is a different story, but on the way over here in my Uber, I passed a church that was decommissioned, a Catholic church, the Church of the Nativity, a couple of years ago. It's where Dorothy Day's funeral was, actually. Wow. Yeah, and I just thought that was fitting that I would notice that. I had never noticed that before. Obviously, we have different issues here in a big urban city. But what the first question I'm going to ask you is, so what can the church do with this information that you've gathered here?
So the church has to see itself as an institution of civil society and think about, to use Catholic language, the corporal works of mercy. And so part of that is obviously feeding the hungry and bringing in the needy. But for the middle class, there's something else. So the church should be trying. There's one thing that the church does that's irreplaceable, right? And that's the sacraments. The other things it's doing, it's largely doing contingently. It's filling gaps in society. And so my one of the priests in my parish asked me a few years ago, he said, look, when I was a kid, to get youth sports, you needed the parish. Or if you were hungry, you needed the parish. And now you don't need that. In Montgomery County, Maryland, there's so many elite youth sports, et cetera, and there's so much government provision of these. And he said, what is the need of the people, again, Silver Spring type area, middle class, upper middle class, some working class, suburbanites? And I said, what we need is a place to bring our children and ignore them while we socialize with other adults. That is merciful. And so he said, okay, do it. So I started a T-ball team that's just an excuse to have a parish picnic, okay? So that's a very sort of day-to-day thing. But that's a sort of an example of how to say, let's be the sort of thing that brings people together and try to make sure that they're not just the people who are showing up every Sunday, that they're not just showing up and leaving. And that's not an easy thing to do. Our pastor called us in and he said to a lot of us, you have to go up to at least one person after Mass who you've never seen before, preferably somebody who you think hasn't come before, and introduce yourself. So that, again, is a very small thing. But there's obviously a lot bigger issues. There's a lot of reasons why people have stopped going to church. And some of it is the alienation. I know lots of people said, I'd show up and nobody would talk to me, so I stopped coming. Which, of course, is a bad reason to do it. But another is because our church committed horrible wrongs. And coming face to face with that is absolutely essential. There's a guy at my local bar, and not every story ends up at a bar.
They do seem to.
But that is a big difference. People say, what's the difference between this and Charles Murray's book or J.D. Vance's book? I said, there's a lot more church, a lot more bars. But at my local bar, and he saw the church. He said, I used to go to church. I was a Catholic. And so at this point, you're like, okay, I'm tested. I have to try to bring this guy back. But then the story he told me about how he couldn't I forget what his expertise was. It was like fixing cars, and he was going to show kids in the parish how to fix cars. But because he hadn't been through all the testing and the background check, he couldn't do it. And the priest who did it then later was credibly accused of sexual assault. And I had no argument to make to this guy. So what does the church have to do? Let's start by making amends and doing what we can to stop driving people away justifiably is step number one. And after that, how do we make parishes? And I really do think it has to be on a local level. How do we make parishes be these institutions that provide connection, a sense of purpose, and a human level safety net?
I do a lot on adoption and foster care, and evangelicals have this huge advantage because they don't have institutions. So we think, well, somebody's taking care of that problem, whatever that problem is. How do you change the mindset in a Catholic parish?
Well, again, in a parish, so one of the things about I say about institutions of civil society is that they're controlled by the people who belong to them, which sounds different from a Catholic parish, right? There's one guy who calls the shots unless the guy above him tells him that the shots are different. But in real life, the way at least my parish, St. Andrew's, functions is things happen when there's enough people who are willing to do it, make it happen. There's T-ball because I was able to rally together 3 other people who could redo the infield. We have adoration, not because Father Dan said, all right, we're going to do adoration. It's because enough ladies came to him and said, let's do around-the-clock adoration. We have trips to Jamaica, not because Father Dan told us to do trips to Jamaica. Once he had enough guys who were willing to do it, he said, all right, guys, we're doing a trip to Jamaica, mustard seed. It's for people, basically orphans with intellectual disabilities in Jamaica. These things happen because the members make them happen. So that's sort of how that spirit infests some parishes and not others is sort of something of a mystery to me. But that is what I would think of, is that it has to be very clear that the laity is going to be the ones that make it happen, which sounds un-Catholic. It can sound Protestant in a way, but it's absolutely the truth, and I think it's the way that parishes have probably always functioned.
Well, and too, when you think of like priest shortages and all of this, it's the only way it's going to work, right? So these poor guys you write about who are not marriage material, who are feeling purposeless, what is there for them right now? Is there anything for them?
So the definition of alienation I use is from Robert Nisbet, who wrote about this problem decades and decades ago in a book called The Quest for Community. And his definition of alienation is that it's not just being detached from society, it's not seeing the purpose in society. So that's a major obstacle in the alienated parts of the country, among the alienated populations, is people who say, I don't see why I need that. Why should I, on a religious front, just saying, if you have a very devout religious person, like if you read Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance's Mamaw, personal relationship with Christ, praying more than I ever do, very devout. Why do I need a church to tell me what to do? I mean, everybody who's a Catholic has probably heard that argument against organized religion, but it's true in all sorts of other ways. Especially, if you can get what you need and keep it in your fridge and cook it and maybe even have it delivered and you don't have to leave your house. And if you've got your disability check and your food stamps, why would I need something else? So this is why I don't have an easy answer for that. To get people out of a rut when they don't think there's anything but the rut is incredibly difficult. And there's this sort of idea, well, if you don't have a job, or if you just have a part-time job, you should have more time to do other things. Go and coach a youth football team or something like that. But that's not what happens. The stats I cite in here from Nick Eberstadt, an AEI colleague, is that men who have dropped out of the labor force watch about 2,000 hours of TV or video or YouTube or whatever on their phones, on their computers, on their TVs. So that's a full-time job, 2,000 hours a year. And so the main obstacle is not seeing a purpose of plugging into these institutions.
Is there something in some of these communities? Have you seen anything that gives you some hope that education or there's some way to prevent this from happening again if these poor guys can't be helped?
So the one thing that I saw, and this church is right outside of Williston, North Dakota, which is at the heart of the fracking boom. And so when I went there in 2011, there was lots of guys with money, but there wasn't any community. And one of the studies about fracking towns like Williston is that, because there were liberal economists who said working class men aren't getting married because they can't afford a family. Said, what happens when working class men in these oil towns get a lot of money? Well, they have more children, but they actually don't get married any more than they used to. I think, though, that that's a temporary phase. I think even with oil prices going up and down, there's been money flowing into Williston now for about 15 years. And a Little League restarted. And the public school added a wing. And more of the parents there are rebuilding. So this is sort of the cause effect of the money and the civil society. It goes both ways. But one thing is, money can't solve the problems, but money can create the situation where you can, over the years, if people are committed to a place, rebuild it. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I've been trying to study a little bit more since I wrote the book about this trend among a lot of evangelicals of church planting. And I recently learned that a lot of this, they're like doing it in Williamsburg, Virginia. They're saying, like, we want the hipsters. But the thing is that if you're targeting the people who already belong to 12 things, that's a much harder picking than going out to the places where people don't belong to anything. And so increasingly I've seen more, half of the reviews of my book were by evangelicals who said, hey, we need to do church planting in the country, and we're doing this and that. So I want to see if that works. Again, somebody stopped going to church and doesn't see the point in it, you might not be able to get them out, and it'll take some creativity on the local part. But that's what I would look for in the future. Are there church plantings, Catholic, Protestant, Mormon, etc., going to the places precisely where they see people suffering from all these maladies?
I've been to some of these evangelical churches, I'm sure you have, where they have a cafe, they have it sounds like if they set up a bar, maybe that would be an entry point.
And I could put that on my expense report. Yeah.
There you go. So the idea for the book, did it happen just while you were on the campaign trail in your Irish bars? And were you just eating dinner, or were you really looking for a copy?
Yes. I'm always looking for copy. And if you can get copy, Wi-Fi, dinner, and a beer at the same time, that's the optimal evening for me. But when I realized that Make America Great Again was rooted in the premise that America is not currently great, and that Trump set up that line by saying, the American dream is dead. That sort of haunted me a little, and I thought, why do people think that? And there were a dozen explanations of why this was going on. But again, I started the story here with the places where it was most alive, and it was probably sitting at that diner counter in Oostburg and just thinking anybody would want to raise their kids here. And there was this mechanic who works at the farms right outside. So if your tractor breaks down, Dan Albrecht is the guy you call. Dan said to me, I said, do you have any complaints about Oostburg? And Dan said, well, I sent my kids to the public school, and I showed up to the Christmas concert a few months ago, and there were no seats. And I look over, I see my neighbors who send their kids to the Christian school taking up the seats. And I say, Joe, why are you taking my seat? And he says, hey, Dan, we all got to come see our kids, using the phrase our kids to describe not their biological kids, their kids they have custody over. Oostburg's kids were our kids. That story right there drove home to me. In rural America, rural Wisconsin, we're 2 towns away, there was all the opioids, all the plagues of things. That's what really brought it home to me, that there was something so accessible about the American dream. It wasn't just the wealthy that have it. It's just thoroughly middle-class place has it because it has these 4 churches sort of standing there as the scaffolding. It was probably that moment in Judy's Diner that really brought it home.
And so that's basically Robert Putnam's layest book a couple of years ago.
Again, I have more church and more bars.
Right. Well, I'm curious, after you did this, did you go back to things like that and have critiques? Or
Yeah, so Putnam has 1 chapter on church in his book, Bowling Alone. And in that chapter, it might even be in a footnote. He says 50% of all civic activity in America begins in churches and church-related institutions. Half of civil society is in a church, and he gives it one chapter. I mean, and he makes it be about bowling. He could have had it, be praying alone or anything else like that, and it would have been a lot more poignant. I think people were afraid of writing about religion because it seems preachy to do it. I mean, and social scientists don't even like talking about a lot of this stuff. So Melissa Carney, not related to me, she did that study on the fracking towns, but she said, all my colleagues hated hillbilly elegy because it said the root of the problems here is culture. And we hate that explanation because we have trouble measuring culture. And they want it to be a purely economic explanation, but it's a lot deeper. So that would be my criticism of, and David Autor is a great economist, and I rely on him for a lot of the work I do. But again, he can never go past a materialistic explanation of it, never get into the point of understanding the importance of institutions of civil society. When he talks about the retreat from marriage, when wages go down, he uses phrases like a decline in the complementarity functions of marriage. And when he talks about how people don't want to leave their hometown, he laments it by saying the mobility reactions to trade shocks are incomplete. Like these people can't understand why you wouldn't have a complete mobility reaction to a trade shock, why you wouldn't just move out of town. So that was my main critique of the literature, is that they were too materialistic.
So it takes a village, right? Running with that a little bit, are there things? First of all, was there anybody who got the book on the left yet? And then is there any like common ground policy, something?
So there's this guy who probably would have been the enemy in my first two books on like liberal corporate welfare. He was a Goldman Sachs banker who's a lefty named Chris Arnaud. He wrote a book called Dignity. But as I was writing the columns that led up to the book, every time I wrote it, when I wrote my column from Oostburg, when I wrote my column from Williston, he wrote me, he was like, you're onto it. And he
Wow.
says, I'm not a believer, but I realize that what these people, a lot of the people who are hanging on in these tough places, it's church that's keeping them hanging on. And I got some mostly positive liberal reviews that just says, but Carney doesn't understand that the welfare state is needed to keep this stuff together. And I do think there's common ground. But I think it's totally meaningless in our current situation, because at the most important point, there's a vast disagreement. Beto O'Rourke yesterday said that he would go after the Catholic Church and almost every Islamic mosque and every Orthodox Jewish synagogue, and with the force of the IRS, because they won't do gay marriages and support gay marriage. And the Obama administration and Elizabeth Warren and all of these people, what they want to do is chase the church out of the public square. Nancy Pelosi, when being asked about the Little Sisters of the Poor case, had a sort of telling point. She said, look, I do my religion on Sundays. She added that sometimes she goes to mass midweek, which again, like probably she goes much more than I do midweek. So I'm not saying she's a bad Catholic. I'm saying that line, I do my religion on Sundays, is impossible. And it was so telling when Obama would say freedom of worship. There's no freedom of worship in the Constitution. It's a free exercise of religion. And we cannot exercise our religion for 1 hour on Sundays, or even when we're in mass 7 days a week, like hopefully Nancy Pelosi does. To exercise our religion, we have to love our neighbor. And to love our neighbor, we need to build these institutions of civil society, and one of them has to be church. And so the Obama administration's argument in Hobby Lobby was, in effect, you lose your free exercise of religion once you enter into the marketplace. And a lot of the arguments that have been made after that is every individual has a free exercise of religion, and every church has a right to teach what it wants to teach. But once you enter into the public square, you're not allowed to abide by your own conscience, which is, in other words, saying, you guys need to do your religion just on Sundays, just behind those closed doors. And if that is at the heart of their party, and right now it looks like it is, if that is at the heart of the left, then there is no common ground. Because what they're trying to do is bulldoze this church. And if you knock down the church, then you knock down civil society for the working class and the middle class.
Was it last year where the Knights of Columbus became the enemy in the
Yeah, the Knights
Senate,
of Columbus were a hate group, according to
Right.
Kamala Harris.
And I'm not sure who does more civil society work than them. So how much of this is our fault, though? The the sense that we are bigots and there's no added value having us around.
So again, not us, the laity, but the Catholic Church, sowed immense distrust through the abuse and the cover-ups. And then a lot of the church has given up on the corporal works of mercy for the needy. They say, okay, well, the government's taking care of it. Good, that's one more thing off our back. As if that was going to free up resources, when it does the opposite. It dilutes your resources because you don't have as many volunteers. You don't have as many people in the seminaries. You don't have as many nuns because they lose a sense of purpose. And I think that I talk about crowding out in the book, but that makes it sound like it's all a push. I think some of it was a push and some of it was a voluntary retreat.
And some of it, doesn't it go back to Catholic culture during the Kennedy years? And there's always the sense that we have to apologize, or we have to prove ourselves that we're sophisticated. And
yeah, and so that's elite Catholic culture. If you go to sort of Fishtown, which is one of the places I write about in the book, because Charles Murray used it as sort of the old working class white place that has collapsed. And one of the two Catholic churches there shut down. They had like an Irish neighborhood and a Polish neighborhood. And so this is really interesting and a challenge. Now, first of all, I bring it up to say that these people weren't trying to be sophisticated. The parents in the neighborhoods, their joint higher purpose was raising their kids in the church. But it was also interesting because it's a different idea of America than I think is held either on the right or the left today. The idea that you would belong to a Polish parish can be really uncomfortable. To posit a we, you often have to posit a they. To have a tight-knit community, there has to be people who aren't in it. There has to be some sort of admissions test, so to speak. Now, ideally, in sort of the abstract in a Catholic church, the only admissions test is going to be, do you believe? Can you say the creed and mean it? But the way American communities have often formed has been, maybe it's just an accident of what side of the train tracks you live on. Maybe it's ethnic. Maybe it's Catholic versus Protestant, or the Christian Reformed Church versus the Reformed Church of America. But so that patchwork, I think, is really a defining characteristic of really strong communities. But again, it's a little awkward because there's something that can sound exclusive about it. And this is what a lot of people say. Well, I showed up at the church and I felt totally left out because I wasn't Italian, or because I was an immigrant from North Africa, or because I had purple hair, or because whatever. And so that's a very interesting tension. And it's hard to even say it out loud, right? Like, we should have more Irish neighborhoods. It's not something you can say out loud without getting chased out of town. But there's something to be said that instead of the image of a melting pot, which a lot of conservatives like talking about, an image of a patchwork is more important, because people should belong to many different things. You belong to your neighborhood, you belong to your parish, you belong to your swim club, you belong to your public school, you belong to political parties used to like be real things and not just a letter on a ballot. And that belonging to many different things in this patchwork is really something that was uniquely American, and that we've largely lost, and that'll be really hard to get back because it sounds so exclusionary in some ways.
so, with all the hostility on the left toward religion, what can be done? I mean, is it the parish by parish trying to really build community? I mean, there has to be a plan, right?
Yeah. No, I'm not that great at solutions. My first book, it went from like ethanol is bad to Export-Import Bank is bad to the sugar subsidies bad to the index. And so then my second book, I put a solutions chapter on, and I went back and read it years later, and like half of it was really bad idea. I was talking about the gold standard, etc. So I was really hesitant about a solutions chapter here. But I do have some. And earlier you had asked about common ground with the left. Urbanism is something the left is much better at. Building places that are walkable, that would be hugely conducive to communities. It's liberals who are more likely to say, hey, we need a park in the middle of our neighborhood where everybody can come. That's absolutely right. Montgomery County, where I live, is built for cars. It's inhuman. People, pedestrians, car accidents, death, all that. But even short of that, even before that, there's the alienation from the fact that you need a car to get everywhere. So there's lots of little policies that can nibble around the edge. More of them are going to be on the local level. The parishes are going to need to revitalize from the laity. So all of this is very bottom up, which makes sense, right? You can't have a federal department of community cohesion. It's a contradiction. The centralization is a lot of what killed this. So I do not have a national plan. I sort of tell everybody you should go to church, and but the other thing I say is, so I mean, this building is named after a giant of a man, and nobody in this room is going to be Fulton Sheen. And I would speak in places in Western Michigan that were named after the Van Andels and the DeVosses, who had billions of dollars. And what all these people did, who became massively wealthy or massively powerful, was build institutions of civil society, and that's what they should do. But nobody in this room is going to be able to do that, right? So I come back home to my own parish. You will see a sign that says the Terrence McCardle Athletic Fields right outside of my parish. Terrence McCardle was not a big donor to St. Andrew Apostle Parish. Terrence McCardle was a kid who, when he dropped out of college, was just sort of wandering around the St. Andrews campus back in the 1960s, and the head of the CYO football coach said, hey, Terrence, you used to play defense. Can you be my defensive coordinator? He had nothing else to do. He had dropped out of college, so he did it for a couple seasons. They racked up the record for the most shutouts ever in Montgomery County, CYO. Terrence ended up dying in a car crash in his 20s, but that's who we have our field named after. Our baseball field is named after a guy named Mike DeToli, who coached T-ball and baseball there for years. On the back of my daughter's basketball jersey is his name, Al Weaver. This was a guy who just, even when his kids didn't play sports, he coached them. He ran the altar boys. He did everything, and just immensely involved. And everybody can be that. Not everybody can be Fulton Sheen. Not everybody can be the DeVosses. Every single person can be Al Weaver, Mike DeToli, Terrence McCardle, can be the Julie Benjamin in my parish who runs the Sunday school. And that's what it takes. And there's a mindset in Washington that everybody needs a big solution. But that's mostly counterproductive. Mostly we're going to need 10 million little solutions.
So what is it, do you think, that makes your parish work? Is it big families? Is it adoration? Is it?
We have a very dynamic pastor. We had an unfortunate accident at the parish schools, mostly black parish school in downtown Silver Spring, and a mostly Hispanic parish school in another part of Silver Spring shut down. So the most involved parents from those two parishes all flocked to our parish. So we got this immense socioeconomic and racial diversity, but also very, very involved parents showing up. A pastor who lives, Christ-like sacrifice for his parish and will do anything, and makes it so that all of us say, oh gosh, I really don't want to go to the Principals Advisory Council, but if Father Dan can visit a hospital at 11 o'clock after doing all of this, I can go to this Principals Advisory Council meeting. We're kind of middle class, but we do have a significant number of people who are college educated and are above median income. And sadly, that's highly correlated with really robust institutions of civil society, as I lay out in this book. I think our parish is actually stronger than the real wealthy ones. When Father Dan asked me how my book was doing, I said it didn't sell enough that I could move to Our Lady of Mercy in Potomac, also known as Our Lady of Mercedes. But I actually think we're stronger than them, and I don't know why. I should. I'm the guy who wrote a book on this. But some of it is going to be chemistry. But I think most of it is stuff that can be a little bit measurable, which was a pastor dedicated to building community, and a lot of really involved parents and intact families. That's the other thing. The single moms and the single dads, however much they want to do the stuff to build up the community to coach t-ball, they can't pull it off. And it's another reason why higher educated and higher income people are more able to do this. I could coach t-ball because I could tell my boss, hey, guess what? Every Friday I'm going to leave at 4:15, and that can work. If you're a bartender, you don't even know what hours you're going to work until 3 days before, so you can't possibly sign up to coach kindergarten girls basketball or whatever. And so this is one reason why sort of the upper middle class and above will have stronger institutions. And so we have a lot more geographic segregation by income and education now than we used to. If you read Coming Apart, there's a lot more towns that would have all sorts of people who would do it, including the guys who worked at the factory who knew they got off at 4 every day and so could then coach, but also the highly educated guys, the highly educated women, etc. Now, Chevy Chase is like 99% PTA moms, while Uniontown doesn't have anybody who's going to show up to back to school night.
At some points in your book, you talk about factory jobs were stability and even like virtue building for people. We don't really think of that.
No, and
that way.
I had sort of missed, this is literally the oldest story in this book, comes from 2005, and I'd missed the import when it happened. I showed up at this GE factory that was shutting down. The guy who was they made refrigerators in Bloomington, Indiana. This guy who was, who worked there, Joe Adams was his name. He had just gotten laid off. And he was telling me, he said, I was confused. When I tried to get a job here 10 years ago, they asked me what experience I had in the factory. I said, why do I need experience? This is unskilled labor. Like, when I went in, I was surprised that it wasn't being done by robots, the building of the assembling of the refrigerators. He said, what experience did I need? And the guy said, do you show up on time? Do you work and not stop until the whistle? Can you do the mundane? And can you see yourself doing this again and again and again for the foreseeable future for decades and decades? And that was the experience needed there. And it sounds really mundane until you get married and have kids and you realize that these unskilled jobs, the skill is the same as the skill of being a husband and a dad. Can you just do stuff you really don't want to do? Like when the babies are new and they're kind of boring and you just have to hold them for hours on end, like changing diapers. And if you ever think, okay, how many diapers do I have left to change? You're never going to survive. You just have to do it with your nose down, and you have to do it for decades. You have to commit yourself to one thing for years and years. So these are virtues. These are virtues of reliability is mostly what it is, which is sometimes not always the best compliment. I do actually remember once you complimented when I was freelancing for you, you said, Tim's very reliable. And I thought, nobody would call Kevin Williamson reliable. Kevin Williamson's writing like these beautiful essays and they're this and that and they're all over the place. And if I'm in bars, like who knows, he's in drug dens or whatever. But if Catherine's like, give me 500 words by 4 p.m., I got her 500 words by 4 p.m. So it's not always the highest compliment, but guess what? For family building, reliability is the number one virtue that's needed. And factory jobs used to cultivate and reward those virtues. And with them absent, even if the guy gets put pieces together some money. Oh, I'm driving Uber. Oh, I have this part-time thing in the winter. I'm doing Christmas trees. There's not the same level of commitment. And so we develop these lives. And again, this happens up and down. I focus on working class in the book, but up and down, we're becoming more of a transactional society and less of a relational society. And the factory job was something that built a relationship on reliability. And with that evaporating, then that's one reason there's less family formation.
So despite getting the Grubhub gift card, you are not a fan of these things, Uber, and because now I don't call you for a ride to the airport. And
no, I remember like calling people for a ride to airport, or friends would lend me their car because I would drive them to the airport and then I would pick it up, and you relied on neighbors. And so the sort of irony is that the wealthy are A, more able to afford all of these things that replace neighbors, but B, they're actually more likely to be plugged in to their neighbors and to ask them for favors and do favors for them. Not the super wealthy who have gates and fences, but that's like a 1% of a 1%. But yeah, that when you need people for something sort of every day, it builds relationships that go deeper than every day. I use the example in there of what if Bernie Sanders realized how many people were going to a diner for breakfast? and said, "Oh, they're greenhouse gas emissions. This is horrible. And poor people can't necessarily afford it, and there's exploitation of the women behind the counters. So what I'm going to do is get everybody a coffee maker and send everybody eggs and send everybody a frying pan, and they can all eat breakfast at home, and then they'll have free time and they can all get together afterwards at a park." Guess what? People stopped going to the diner and they wouldn't get together afterwards at the park. I think a lot of modern technology is one of the contributing causes to the alienation, both up and down that's the one that applies most evenly up and down the income lines. But again, you might be tempted to assume that it's the wealthy who are most alienated that way. When it comes to technology drawing us away from people around us, there's multiple articles about like the parents in Silicon Valley saying that my kids are not going to have a phone. And in fact, they hire nannies who sign a contract who say, "I will not take out a smartphone or any device like that in front of your children at all." They're sending them to schools that are deliberately sort of unplugged schools. And so I think we're going to see the sort of more attached to the devices and less attached to the humans around you be another working class phenomenon when we look at this in 5 and 10 years.
Just a warning, I'm going to open this up to questions in a few minutes, so get your questions prepared. A week or so ago, I was down here at a fundraiser for the Gianna Center, great pro-life healthcare ministry, and it was raining. And I noticed as I was waiting for my Uber that there were all these people in their 20s, 30s, 40s walking their dogs, single people, or one person with a dog or 2 dogs, right? And so I have to ask this to you because it's the most important thing about you. We're here, Planned Parenthood's on the other side of this wall. I know you don't do solutions, but how do you change a culture? I mean, you have 6 kids. That's insane in this area. Anyone would think that's insane.
It's insane anywhere.
But actually, we know lots of people with 6 kids. You and I do. Is there any way of changing the culture?
So again, if on the narrow question, if you want more people to get married and have kids, and people who have 1 kid to have more kids, and by the way, you should. At the actual fertility, number of children had by American women is below the desired fertility. That is to say, if we were the public policy magicians who could just say, "We're going to give you what you want," and not pass any judgment, we would be giving more people more children. If you want to do that, one way I put it is, have you ever heard somebody say, "Oh, this neighborhood is a great place to raise a kid"? We should make as many places as possible great places to raise kids. It takes a village thing. It takes an infrastructure. Sometimes it's a built environment. It's having a park with a playground. Sometimes it's in where my wife grew up. There were years where there was no kids, and then one by one, a couple families moved in with kids, and this one woman would sort of almost audaciously just take her kids for walks around the neighborhood, just to walk past somebody else who might be stepping out to get their mail and like wave them down. And then another woman just said, "We're going to have a potluck every Friday." And so these 2 moms went out of their way and made their neighborhood a good place to raise kids. So then every other house that went for sale, people saw what was going on. And now this neighborhood that was overrun with kids when my wife was there, but then for 30 years was nothing, now is overrun with kids again. And it didn't happen accidentally. It happened because these couple people said, "We're going to make this the kind of place where people want to raise kids." So there's a million ways to do it. But that's sort of the way to answer your narrow question, is to do that. And also, I don't badmouth dogs. I think of dogs as like practice babies, right? It's a lot of the same thing. It's like, I could give this dog what he wants now and he would stop barking, or I could try to like train him for the long. And sometimes the short-term fix is the right answer, but like learning how to balance that, I think I don't badmouth dogs. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they do displace children, but I think of them as practice kids.
Well, and the other thing about the idea of revitalizing communities and churches, and obviously not everyone can have 6 kids. People have infertility issues. But when you have that parish that's starting to look around and think, what are the needs in this community? Then you're aware of the kids in foster care. And this becomes something that is like part of your identity as a parish. Like, wait, there are these kids who need homes, and wait, there I didn't realize there are families who are foster families, and we should bring them meals, and we should get them gift cards and give them date nights, and it just the whole mentality starts to change. On one last question before I throw it out, on the religious liberty issue, obviously that this is so huge. It's something that hits foster care and adoption. There was just a Michigan case a week ago. What do you see happening there? Knowing how vital the churches are.
I don't think it looks good.
Can we be doing something differently?
I don't know. I mean, because I think that it's so deeply ingrained in the U.S. psyche that one of the greatest evils is discrimination. And that's because the greatest evil we've had as a nation was very closely tied to white discrimination against black people. And so then, this sort of very rapid shift we had on the redefining of marriage has brought us to a point where there's not an argument that can sink in with most people why not to allow gay marriage. The term marriage equality, we were able to write in 2004, that's actually a misnomer, and we could make an argument, and it would be heard. You try to say that today, and people say, what are you talking about? Of course this is a question of equality. So once you start with it being a question of equality on that, once you've taken into account that, the church teaching on contraception is subscribed to by a very small minority of the country, I think we'll be able to keep Catholic hospitals from being forced to abort babies. But on the other things, I just don't think we've laid the groundwork in past years. And if they're willing to move quick enough to sort of drive the nail through, I don't know. Maybe we'll get a miracle. It's happened before. That's how I see us winning that fight.
Well, that's why I think your book is so important. Actually, when our kids came out, I was at an event with Robert Putnam, and he knew I was Catholic, and he at the time, I think Pope Francis was new. It was the beginning of his pontificate, and he said to me, the thing about Pope Francis is people look at him and they think he might actually believe the Sermon on the Mount,
And when he talks about the poor, he very importantly, Pope Francis talks about the inclusion of the poor. And so that's the thing. And you've probably had this experience once in a while where some political liberal who's not religious gets in a debate and then at some point says, well, I'm not talking about Christians like you. I'm talking, and no, okay, I am at the bottom of the list of Christians. You have your prejudices, that sort of thing. But somehow showing that face of saying we are, because there's this perverse idea they get from looking at the political fights that the only thing we do is go around and try to take birth control away from women and talk about abortion. I got my second pro-life homily in my 20 years of going to mass just last week. Okay, this is not something we focus on, but when the political fights get thrust in our face, it is what we talk.
Sunday, they're
That's
supposed to do it, right?
But so why are they only hearing from us when we're getting caught in these political fights? We can't drag them in on Sunday. It's because we need to be out there. The parishes need to be out there. The people who have no involvement, will never come to church, should. This is what the Mormons do. There's a potluck, and they go out there and they don't even try to proselytize. It's just, you're not going to be as afraid of your Mormon neighbors if you're just oh yeah, these are the people who give me the really fun potlucks once a month. And we have to do more than just fun potlucks, obviously, and the Mormons do too. A welfare system, that sort of stuff. Be out there so that when people, it used to be, again, a generation ago, you thought of St. Raphael's, you thought, oh, that's where the kids play football. Mm-hmm. Even something as simple as that, being out there in the public square, because otherwise, if you're not, then the only time they hear from the church is either our scandals or when we get dragged into a political fight that we didn't pick.
Mm-hmm. Okay, questions? Front row here.
Thank you. I should just say as a preamble, I think the church, all the churches actually, should be as concerned about social poverty as economic poverty, which to me has a harder solution, so I'm so glad to hear the conversation. I also grew up in New York City, and I went to an all-male Episcopal school. Back then it was all-male. And I remember great effort was put with the sister schools and to emphasize the difference between, and celebrate the difference between men and women, boys and girls, and inculcate those values with an understanding that you'd have a healthier chance at life if you understood who you were as a man or who you were as a woman. I'm always glad to see that EWTN emphasizes traditional gender. How do you see an understanding of traditional gender as a possible way back, or at least a contributor to a way back?
I'm a huge fan of single-sex education, and what strikes me with my daughter now at an all-girls school is there's some elements that use the same exact language as sort of liberal feminism without being anything like that. But I realized it was my sort of feminism. It was, there are things that women can do that men can't. And I'm not just talking about breastfeeding or having babies. I mean, there's the characteristic, if you look at the saints, there's, we do have Joan of Arc, but if you look at a lot of the saints, there's going to be more of a characteristic of some sort. Saint Bernadette, and what we know about her, is feminine. And that sort of celebration of the feminine. And so I don't know enough about the church history, but I know that so much of both modern capitalism and a lot of 20th century America had an effect of sort of denigrating work. We say, okay, women have a certain job, and then kind of implying that it's less important. And that, overcoming that, is what I think we have a chance to do. And I'm not saying women have a certain job, which is staying home with the kids necessarily, but women have certain roles in society. And, we use the words, because the script gets written by men, it gets written in a way that can denigrate the exceptional traits of women. So that's sort of my view going forward of how we can do a better job, celebrate the differences, and then make sure that the game isn't rigged just in favor of men.
But don't you see, just as a quick follow-up, don't you see that with the change in education level and the different percentages now, and
Yes.
women going
Women
to
are much more likely
the
to
problem
graduate.
is really, going back to the war on boys, back in the 90s, that the problem now is really much more with men than, do you not
No, that
agree?
I think that's right. I think that an idea of, hey, you have a responsibility to care for people more than yourself, is not ingrained, probably. I mean, I'm not an expert on education, but it just seems that way. That certainly that's not being pushed hard on boys. That, like, be the man of the house sort of thing. Like, having some actual meat to it, some meaning to it, is not something that I agree. That's not emphasized.
What are you seeing in a context of sons in a boys all boys school, like a difference in the way that they're teaching them about their identity?
So, and this is the sort of thing that's can be a little bit controversial, but the headmaster of my boys' school tells a story at back to school night, which is from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the kids are walking and they meet the Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, and they're told that Aslan is coming. And Aslan, who's he? Oh, he's a lion, and he's gonna do this, and we need. And one of the kids says, "Is he safe?" He goes, "Safe? No, he's not safe. Are you listening? He's not safe, but he's good." And what they try to teach us is so much of what I see in that message is so much of what replaces virtue today is don't do these bad things. And it was during the Brett Kavanaugh stuff when there was all those accusations. People said, you need to teach your kids not to sexually assault women. Like, hopefully I never have to say those words.
Right.
But partly because hopefully I'm not just teaching them thou shalt nots, right? I'm teaching them thou shalls. I'm teaching them to respect women. I'm teaching them to defend vulnerable from the stronger. So I don't want my son to be the one who just doesn't sexually assault women. I want my son to be the one who punches in the face the guy who's groping the drunk girl. And and so that sort of idea of building that particular type of virtue that can look like danger, that can look like ferocity. I think that's a male trait. If my wife were here, she would do it. She's a alumna of the same school where our daughter goes. If she were here, she would do a better job of articulating the flip side of that.
I do, by the way, think it's really important. I talked about this last night at a dinner. for women to be building up men as well. And I think the culture in the last couple of decades has done a job of building up girls, right? But sometimes to the detriment of the poor guys,
And
right?
building up often means expressing expectations of. It's not just rah-rah cheering for, but it's actually this is your job to do this.
Right.
When there was some boy who had said something obnoxious to my daughter, harassing even in 5th grade, I was traveling and I was just like, oh man, I can't believe that happened. And then Kay said, no, I'm calling you because you need to set this right. And so I called the dad, and the dad profusely apologized, made his son apologize, blah, blah, blah. But Katie made it very clear that if the dad didn't handle this, that I was going to have to talk to this 5th grade boy, and that was my job. And so that was her propping me up, but not like, yay, Tim, you're great. It's, Tim, you have a job, do it.
Right. Question there in the middle?
Tim, welcome back to New York.
Thank you.
I also very much enjoyed reading Alienated America. Certainly we've had a discussion about community building, and you point to 2 communities in your book. One, the Mormon community, the other, Orthodox Jewish community. Particularly with the Mormon community, is there a model that can be replicated, certainly you go into some detail about when someone loses a job, someone else in their tabernacle hears about it and passes that information along, and is that really a model that can be replicated, or is the community, that particular community, too small at a national level?
I think absolutely what the Mormon welfare system can be replicated. In some ways, I think it could be replicated most easily by the Catholic Church because it has a similar structure of a parish and a diocese, etc. And they have analogous structures over there. But why it doesn't happen, I think, is probably a historical question, and it's a failure of the Catholic Church that there isn't a Catholic welfare system. There's ad hoc ones where if if the men who go to the men's group in my parish, if they lose a job, there's somebody constantly taking care of them, hooking them up with job interviews, that sort of thing. But the story I sort of weave, the sort of city and speech in the last chapter. When I wrote a solution chapter, it's kind of like I made it be a fictional solution is what I did. But I thought of a sort of ecumenical thing. There's a Christian Reformed church across the street from St. Andrews. There's those 2 Orthodox synagogues. There's a Mormon church not too far away. What if we all joined together and built something that made sure that everybody in the area who needed a meal could get one? We each take one night of the week. And that would require a very different mindset than church leaders have now. But I certainly think that can be built up. And again, there are food stamps, there is unemployment, there is disability. So what are we providing that's not being provided? Pope Francis used the word include, not cut a check to the poor, include the poor. If we're having communal meals, and so it's a place where, tonight I'm not around, my wife should be able to show up at the fish fry, but again, maybe it's a fish fry that includes 5 different faith traditions, and she puts in $20 in the basket, but somebody else puts in $0 in the basket. That's sort of if you remember the story I spin in the last chapter, that I think provides something that no government program could possibly provide, is the bringing people together and building of connections. So I do think that what the LDS Church does in places like Salt Lake City is A, replicable by the Catholic Church, but B, something like it can be done by nonprofits and mostly church institutions around the country. And I would love, I speak to small groups, and sometimes what I try to do is I try to say, you're from this town. Could you do this? Like, can you have 5 pastors and synagogue presidents all get together and try to pull this off? Like, maybe it doesn't work at all. Maybe it's some impossible pipe dream, but maybe you can do this on a local level, and then it can multiply.
Did you encounter like Catholic charities in any of these places?
Yeah. And again, I was looking for places that had visible signs of overcoming working class woes that could show up in data and that sort of stuff. And I sadly didn't come across too many Catholic communities like that.
By the way, you mentioned Holland, Michigan. I was stuck there last year. Weather got me stuck there. I was actually there for good reasons. But they have heated sidewalks so that the snow. This is like a visual of walkability. So they have a lot of snow. So they have heated sidewalks so the snow melts. So people can they're college students jogging around. I find that amazing.
Well, one more note on Holland, and somebody pointed this out to me. There's like graveyards, like multiple of them next to the churches, and somebody said, well, so we live among our dead in this town. You go to church and you walk past either grandma's gravestone or the gravestone of somebody you never heard of before, and that's something again that doesn't happen in a lot of modern life.
Right. We have time for one more question.
So, thank you, Tim. I listened to a lot of podcasts, and when your book first came out, I listened to a lot of your interviews on The Federalist, but in particular, I was curious about your interview with Christina Hoff Sommers and the Femsplainers, because later on in that interview, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is it seems that the host of that show agreed or found a lot of your research really interesting, and they seem to be very amenable to the thesis of your research. Mm-hmm. But I found towards the very end of the interview, there was something really interesting that you didn't really get a chance to respond to, which was, as in agreement as they were and as amenable as they were, there was this one moment where Christina was like, but the idea that a return to religion is a viable option for societies is essentially completely ridiculous. And thank you, this is the end of the podcast. So I was really curious, and I've actually been waiting for you to come here because I was excited. I really wanted to hear
podcast.
What would you have said if Christina gave you a moment to say, how do you respond to that? And
we have had, in America particularly, multiple great awakenings. So the idea that it's not going to happen again, that our contemporary problems can't be overcome, I think is hogwash. And even when we talk about worrying about the effects of our tools, our technology, and how it's changing us, a lot of that I think we have to think of as a shock that it takes a little while to respond to. And we have multiple shocks of modernity, of the sexual revolution, and not accidentally at the same time the church scandals, and the politics and the ups and downs of the evangelical church. And I think that those are temporary things. I mean, nothing helps you see in a long-term view than being a Catholic and knowing a little bit about your church. So I think it's total hogwash and totally way too grounded in the here and now to say that we're not going to happen. I think it can happen. I don't think it's inevitable, but I think we can have another great awakening. And it's part of what I'm trying to light a tiny little spark for with this book.
Yeah, no, Tim, I really think you make a tremendous contribution by doing this book and just who you are and what you do. I mean, you take your faith seriously and you don't just do it on Sundays, and it shows, and we're not going to get into a better place unless people are doing that. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your book. And thank you all for being here tonight. Please thank Tim.
Thank you.